Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Into the Killing. In this episode, we're going to take a look at two brutal murders that were unsolved for decades. These two cases have some eerie similarities. The first case we'll look at happened on Easter weekend 1960 in McAllen, Texas. McAllen is a city in the Rio Grande Valley, not far from the border of Mexico. It was home to about 32,000 people in 1960. A resident of the city was 25-year-old Irene Garza. Garza was born on November 15, 1934 in McAllen. Her family owned and operated a dry cleaning business. Garza was a beautiful and popular young woman. She was a twirler, head drum majorette, and homecoming queen. In 1958, she was named Miss South Texas. In 1960, 25-year-old Garza was teaching second grade. Garza was a devout Catholic. She went to church every Sunday, and every Saturday she went to confession. On the evening of Saturday, April 16th, Garza went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen. It was Holy Saturday, which is the day before Easter, and she was dressed in a white veil. Irene made the sign of the cross as she entered the sanctuary. She knelt in a pew to pray. Then she went to wait in line for confession. People remember seeing her in the church, but no one remembered her leaving. Garza lived with her parents, and they became worried when she didn't return home that night. So she was reported missing. Her car was found parked outside the church the next morning. A massive search for the former beauty queen began. In an orchard in the southwest part of the city, her left shoe and her purse with her driver's license in it were found 3 days after she was last seen. Police on horseback rode through the orange groves in search of some more clues. Detectives went door to door around the church and followed up on hundreds of leads. Divers searched the irrigation canal as patrol planes circled above. On the morning of April 21st, about 5 days after she went missing, two people noticed something odd floating in the canal in the center of the city. It was a burlap sack with what appeared to be a human head coming out of the top of it. They called the police. The police came to the canal and discovered it was a body that was face down. They pulled the body from the canal and they concluded it was 25-year-old Irene Garza. Her body was found about 3 miles from where her shoe and purse were found. Close to the orchard where those items were found was a canal. The police thought it was possible that Garza's body was put in the canal near the orchard and it floated to the center of the city. Garza's body was still clothed in her dress, but her underwear was missing. There was no water in her lungs, so the medical examiner thought that she was already dead when she went into the water. Garza had been struck in the head with a blunt object and most likely suffocated. She had also been sexually assaulted. Days and then weeks went by and no arrests were made in the case. 2 weeks after the murder, the police drained the canal. They found a Kodak slide viewer. The police thought it might have been tied to Garza's body as a way to weigh the body down. The police went public with the discovery of the slide viewer in the hopes of finding the owner. This actually worked. 2 days after the article was published, the police received a letter from a 27-year-old Catholic priest named John Feit. Feit said that the slide viewer belonged to him, but he never explained how it got in the canal. Feit was not the priest of the church where Garza had gone for confession, but he was stationed there that day to help with a busy Easter weekend. The police decided to interview Feit because he admitted the slide viewer was his and he was at the church where Garza had gone on the night she went missing. Feit initially denied taking Garza's confession, but then later he admitted he did take her confession. He said he heard her confession in the rectory, which is the house where the priest lives. This was odd because at the time, priests rarely did confessions face to face. Instead, they did them in a confessional. So the police only became more suspicious of Feit. Feit was the last person to see Garza alive, and one of his belongings was pulled from the canal where her body was dumped. Then the police learned something important. 3 weeks before Garza was murdered, a 20-year-old woman named Maria America Herrera went to pray at a Catholic church in Edinburgh, Texas. Edinburgh is a neighboring city of McAllen. The church Herrera went to pray at is about 11 miles from Garza's church. When Herrera entered the church, she noticed a young man in the back pew. He was wearing horn-rimmed glasses. She went up to the altar to pray. Suddenly, the man grabbed her from behind and put a handkerchief or towel over her mouth. Herrera was able to bite the man's finger. He threw her against the wall, and she used this as an opportunity to escape. Herrera thought that the man who attacked her was a priest. But she was a devout Catholic. It felt bad even thinking a priest could do something like that. The police talked to people who knew John Feit, and they noticed that around the time of the attack, he had an injured finger. Feit was asked about his finger injury, and he said he cut it on a mimeograph machine. Feit underwent 32 polygraph exams regarding both the attempted sexual assault and the murder. It was determined that he was being dishonest. The police had Feit stand in a lineup. Herrera identified Feit as the man who attacked her. On August 10, 1960, Feit was charged with attempted sexual assault. But he was nowhere to be found. He ended up turning himself in a week later on August 17th. He proclaimed he was innocent and he had not been hiding. John Feit went to trial in September 1961 for the attempted rape. The case ended in a mistrial because the jury couldn't come to a unanimous decision. Instead of going to trial again, in March 1962, Feit pleaded no contest to the attempted rape charge. He was fined $500. After the trial, Feit was transferred out of the area. For reasons that were never made public, he was not charged with the murder of Irene Garza. Many people, including Garza's family, believe it was because of the influence of the Catholic Church. In 1963, John Feit was sent to the Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri. The plan was for him to train to be a monk. But after a few months, it was decided that the abbey wasn't a good fit for him. So he was sent to a retreat for troubled priests in New Mexico. He worked there until December 1971, and then he left the priesthood. He settled in Phoenix, Arizona, got married, and his wife went on to have 3 children. He worked as an insurance salesman for several years, and then he went to work for the St. Vincent de Paul. He was heavily involved in charity and volunteerism. The murder of Irene Garza continued to be cold. We're just going to take a quick break to talk about our sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh is an amazing meal kit service that cuts out the stress from meal planning and grocery trips. With HelloFresh, you can still enjoy cooking and have dinner ready in about 30 minutes or less. Every week they have at least 25 recipes to choose from. There is something for everyone, with everything from vegetarian meals to craft burgers and extra special gourmet options. All the recipes were designed by professional chefs and nutritional experts to ensure deliciousness and simplicity. It's really not surprising to me that HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. I'm not really much of a cook myself. The closest I come to cooking fancy meals is eating meals prepared by celebrity chef Hector Boyardee. But I found HelloFresh's recipes really easy to follow. I made this delicious creamy basil pesto cheese tortellini with crispy bacon and corn. As I was eating it, I couldn't believe I made something like that. The meal tasted so good that I was thinking about it days later. Even as I'm talking about it right now, I'm craving it. Why not check out HelloFresh for yourself? Just go to hellofresh.com/criminallylisted12 and use the code criminallylisted12 for 12 free meals, including free shipping. Once again, go to hellofresh.com/criminallylisted12 and use the code criminallylisted12 for 12 free meals, including free shipping. Make life easier for yourself and eat great food by checking out America's #1 meal kit, HelloFresh. In 2002, the Texas Rangers reopened the case, but the investigator assigned to the case was having problems getting traction. Coincidentally, that same year, the police in San Antonio, Texas received a letter from a former monk named Dale Tashney. Tashney had been at the Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri in 1963. He was told that a priest named John Feit, who had murdered a woman, was coming to the abbey. Tashney's superiors asked him to counsel Feit and see if he would make a good monk. Over the next several months, Feit told Tashney about the murder of the woman. He said that he had sexually assaulted her and then hid her in the basement of the rectory. He later moved her to a different location. He killed her the next day, which was Easter Sunday, by putting her in a bathtub and putting a plastic bag over her head. The ranger then talked to Father Joseph O'Brien, who was the priest at the church when Garza was killed. O'Brien told the ranger that he was suspicious that Feit might have been responsible for Garza's disappearance when he first heard about it. He noticed some scratches on Feit's hands on the night she went missing. On Easter Sunday, he and another priest looked in the basement and the attic at the church for any traces of Garza. In a later interview with the ranger, O'Brien said that he confronted Feit and demanded to know about Garza's murder. Feit said they had killed Garza in the bathtub. The ranger then went to the district attorney with the information. The district attorney did not think that there was enough evidence to prosecute a 42-year-old case. One major problem was that there was no physical evidence like DNA or fingerprints. Also, one of the witnesses, Joseph O'Brien, had dementia. The media learned that Feit had confessed to both O'Brien and Tashney. In turn, they pressured the district attorney to charge Feit. So in March 2004, the case was brought in front of the grand jury. When neither O'Brien nor Tashney were subpoenaed to testify. On June 9, 2004, the grand jury declined to indict Feit. It looked like John Feit was going to get away with the murder of Irene Garza. A decade went by. Then in 2014, a new district attorney was elected in the county. He promised to look into the murder of Irene Garza. In February 2016, nearly 56 years after the murder, 83-year-old John Feit was arrested in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was subsequently extradited to Texas. He went to trial in December 2017. By that time, one witness who Feit had confessed to had died. Father Joseph O'Brien passed away in 2005. However, Dale Tashney was still alive, and he was the star witness. In the closing arguments, the prosecutor said, "There may be people who don't understand why an old man is being prosecuted, but make no mistake, this is an evil man. He was a predator. He was a wolf in priest's clothing, looking to attack." The jury deliberated for 6.5 hours. Over 57 years after 25-year-old Irene Garza was killed, John Feit was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. That turned out to only be 2 years. In February 2020, 87-year-old John Feit died in prison. As we mentioned in our introduction, our next case has a lot of eerie similarities to the murder of Irene Garza. The first similarity is the day that it happened. April 5th, 1980 was Holy Saturday, which is the day between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. It was the same Catholic holiday that Garza went missing 20 years earlier. This case happened at Mercy Hospital in Toledo, Ohio. Mercy Hospital is a 7-story beige brick and stone building about a mile from Toledo's city center. At the time, the hospital had a convent on the top floor and 2 chapels. The caretaker of the chapels was Sister Margaret Pahl. Sister Pahl was born on April 6, 1908 in Edgerton, Ohio. She entered the convent in 1927. Pahl had a nursing background, and in 1962 she was made Associate Director of Nursing at Mercy Hospital. She held the position for 4 years. In 1971, she took on a new role. She did pastoral care, which involves giving religious and spiritual guidance to patients. She was also in charge of taking care of the chapel's sacristy, which is a room where things like garments and records are kept. By Easter weekend 1980, she was the caretaker of the hospital's chapels. On Holy Saturday, Sister Pahl woke up to her alarm clock at 5:30 a.m. and then she showered. After showering, the nun put on the uniform she had worn for decades, a blue knit dress with a cross pin on the left side of her chest and a black veil. It was a quiet morning because most of the nuns and nurses were either still sleeping or away for Easter. Sister Pahl ate breakfast in a nearly empty dining hall, and at about 6:45 a.m., she went up to go fix up one of the chapels. She pulled up a chair next to the altar, placed a newspaper on top so she wouldn't scratch the chair, and then began to take down the drapes. She then went into the sacristy and knelt down in front of the Blessed Sacrament, completely unaware of who was behind her and what was about to happen to her. Later that morning, another nun at the hospital came into the chapel and noticed it had only been half decorated. Sister Pahl was not in the chapel, and it was unusual for her not to finish a task. The nun walked up to the wooden doors between the chapel and the sacristy and discovered that the doors were locked. She took out her key, unlocked the door, and entered the dark room. She made a horrifying discovery. 71-year-old Sister Pahl was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Her dress had been pulled up and her underwear had been yanked down. The police were immediately called. Sister Margaret Pahl, who was a day shy of her 72nd birthday, had died a vicious death. First, she had been strangled. The killer then acted ferociously with a bladed instrument. In total, she had been stabbed 31 times, 6 times on the left side of the face, 15 times on the left side of the neck, and 9 times on the left side of the chest. The 9 stab wounds seemed to be in the pattern of an inverted cross. The bladed instrument used to stab her was unusual. Knives, which are commonly used in stabbings, have a flat blade. This blade had 4 sides, and the cross-section was in the shape of a diamond or a kite. The coroner said she was penetrated with some kind of object. Also, there was an odd blood smear on her forehead. Although she had been penetrated with an object, it didn't seem like a sex crime. For example, the inverted cross can be associated with Satanism. The way Sister Pahl's genitals were exposed could have been the killer trying to convince the police it was a sex crime. Or it could have been a way to shame or mock the virginal nun. Finally, there was the strange blood smear on her forehead. The investigators thought it was a bastardized version of the last rites. The police began to look at possible motives. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, so it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Also, if she had been raped, it wasn't a sex crime. One possibility was that the killer was a mentally unwell patient, or possibly someone on a strong drug like PCP. But people probably would have noticed someone like that making their way to the chapel or leaving it. A detective who worked on the case thought it was someone who knew Sister Pahl and hated her. He also thought that the killer was trained in religious rituals. Early suspicion fell on a 41-year-old priest named Gerald Robinson. Robinson was born in April 1938. He attended high school that was a minor seminary, and then after he graduated, he joined the seminary. After finishing his training at the seminary, he served at a handful of parishes. He became chaplain of the hospital's chapel 6 years before the murder. Robinson became an early suspect because of his odd behavior. After Sister Pahl's body was found, Robinson was called and told to come to the administrator's office because Sister Pahl had been murdered. He said he just got out of the shower and he would be there shortly. But he never went to the office. On April 8, 1980, Robinson presided over Sister Pahl's funeral. 11 days after the murder, Robinson was brought in to the police station for questioning and a polygraph exam. He told the police that someone had confessed to him that he had killed Sister Pahl. But since it was told to him during a confession, he couldn't reveal the identity of the killer. A short time later, Robinson said he made it up because he was tired and he wanted to end the interview. The police went to Mercy Hospital, hoping to find evidence in Robinson's living quarters that could help their investigation. They looked in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom and in his closet. But then, when they looked on his desk, they found something that caught their eye. It was a silver, sword-shaped letter opener. It was a souvenir from a wax museum in Washington, D.C. It was 9 inches long, and notably, the blade had 4 sides. The police immediately thought it was the murder weapon, so they collected it as evidence. The letter opener was sent to the crime lab, but not much of interest was found on it. It appeared that it had been thoroughly cleaned recently. A tiny speck of blood was found, but nothing could be done with that little amount of blood. It certainly didn't prove that it was used to murder someone. On April 18th, nearly 2 weeks after the murder, Robinson was brought in for questioning again. He was given a polygraph exam, and it was determined that he was being deceitful. About an hour into the interrogation, something very unusual happened. A Monsignor with the diocese, Robinson's lawyer, and the deputy chief of police stopped the interrogation. Then they led Robinson out of the police station. The detectives were told that they wouldn't be talking to Robinson again. Gerald Robinson took his second polygraph exam later that week. This time, the polygraph examiner was chosen by Robinson's lawyer, and the test was done at the headquarters of the diocese. Although the results were inconclusive, it was ruled that Robinson passed the polygraph exam. After that, the case went cold. Gerald Robinson was the only suspect, and the police had no evidence that linked him to the murder. A year after the murder, Robinson was made the pastor at 3 churches in Toledo. He served at those churches until 1989. Robinson was considered a quiet loner who was known for his violent mood swings. In 2002, 22 years after Sister Margaret Pahl's murder, a nun who was never publicly identified contacted the case manager regarding sexual abuse in the diocese. She made several shocking allegations. She said that when she was a young girl, she was sexually abused by Gerald Robinson. As she got older, things only got darker. She claimed that Robinson was a member of a satanic cult that performed satanic rituals. She claimed she was often used in the rituals, in which she was often raped. When she was still just a kid, the rituals took on sadomasochistic elements. She also claimed that the cult killed at least one girl who was about 3 years old during a ritual. The nun said she was 11 years old when it happened and she was forced to watch the murder. The nun claimed she had repressed these memories and they came back to her after seeing news reports about the Catholic Church's clerical sex scandal in Boston in January 2002. Recovered memories are highly controversial, and there is no scientific evidence that people bury traumatic memories in their minds only to have them flood back to them years later. The nun's allegations were reviewed by a board of 6 people. They voted 5-1 not to tell the police about the allegations. The lone person who voted to go to the police, a psychologist, decided to contact the nun, and he convinced her to go to the police herself. She did that in September 2003. This eventually led to Gerald Robinson being investigated as the killer of Sister Margaret Pahl. In the evidence box, the police still had the sword-shaped letter opener that was found in Robinson's living quarters. Also in the evidence box, there was a bloody altar cloth with puncture holes in it. The investigators compared the puncture holes to the letter opener. They thought the letter opener could have made the holes. In February 2004, an expert on bloodstain analysis looked at the cloth. He thought that the letter opener could have been the murder weapon. Other experts reviewed the evidence and they also concluded that the letter opener could have been the murder weapon. An expert in ritual murder said that Sister Pahl's murder had many hallmarks of a ritualistic killing. If Robinson really was involved in Satanism, he may have killed Sister Pahl in a ritualistic way. For example, the murder happened in a sacred space on a holy holiday and the victim dedicated her life to God. All these factors contribute to the Satanist apparently having a stronger experience. The cold case investigators interviewed a doctor who was running to the chapel after Sister Pahl's body was found. He passed a priest who was walking away from the chapel. The description of the priest matched Gerald Robinson. The police talked to 2 other people, and they both saw Robinson near the chapel around the time of the murder. In 1980, shortly after the murder, one of the witnesses was asked if she saw anything unusual that morning. She didn't tell them that she saw Robinson near the chapel because seeing him near the chapel wasn't unusual. She had seen the priest around the chapel hundreds of times. On April 23, 2004, 66-year-old Gerald Robinson was arrested for the murder of Sister Margaret and Pahl. A month later, Sister Pahl's body was exhumed. The letter opener was compared to the stab wounds. The medical examiner concluded that the letter opener was the murder weapon. Gerald Robinson went to trial in April 2006. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence against Robinson was the 3 witnesses who saw him near the chapel around the time of the murder. Also, the murder weapon was found in his living quarters. Another witness, who was an expert in ritual murders, said that the killer was probably familiar with rituals and symbolism, but didn't say that the murder of Sister Pahl had satanic themes. Instead, for motive, the prosecution argued that Robinson despised Sister Pahl because she was domineering. The final straw was when Sister Pahl criticized him the day before she was murdered because he had shortened the Good Friday Mass. The defense pointed out that no DNA evidence or fingerprint evidence proved Robinson committed the murder. In fact, DNA was found under Sister Pahl's fingernails. It was male DNA and it did not belong to Robinson. The prosecution argued that the DNA could have gotten under her fingernails before the murder. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 26 years after Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's murder, 68-year-old Gerald Robinson was found guilty of killing her. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. He would have been able to apply for parole for the first time in 2017 after serving 10.5 years. But he didn't live that long. Gerald Robinson died in a prison hospice in July 2014 at the age of 76. Gerald Robinson is the first and only Catholic priest to be convicted of killing a nun in American history. Robinson always maintained his innocence. He also denied being involved in the satanic cult. No evidence has ever been found to prove the cult ever existed. So he was never charged with any of the alleged crimes that the supposed cult committed. Thanks for listening to this week's episode involving killer priests. As always, our producer and sound designer was Danelle Cloutier. You can check her out on Instagram. A link to her account is in the description box. A major resource in the writing of this episode was the book Sin, Shame, and Secrets: The Murder of a Nun, The Conviction of a Priest, and the Cover-Up of the Catholic Church by David Yonk. You should check it out if you want to read more about the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. If you like this podcast, please subscribe or follow so you don't miss any future episodes. Next week, we'll look at the case of a serial killer who literally butchered his victims. He went without being identified for nearly a decade after his last murder. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please check us out on YouTube. We have over 275 videos featuring some unsettling and bizarre true crime stories. You can find us at youtube.com/criminallylisted. Well, that's all for this week. Thanks again for listening. Please take care of yourself and stay safe.